Hello, you're watching Context. I'm Orkan Amashov here. The United States is reported to have been moving very swiftly to deliver weapons to Ukraine under President Trump's new plan. As some reports indicate that Russia may be preparing for a new summer offensive, possibly only weeks away. The US plan revolves around the idea of European NATO members purchasing American weaponry, including advanced Patriot air defense systems, and supplying them to meet Kiev's needs. There are a number of question marks surrounding this scheme, namely where the systems will come from and how quickly they can reach Ukraine. There also appears to be a degree of friction between the United States and the European Union based on the perception that President Donald Trump is publicly taking credit for sending more weapons to Europe at the expense of European coffers. Turning to Europe, Kiev's continental allies and United Kingdom have welcomed the European Union's 18th sanctions package, which targets Russia's oil and gas industry over its war in Ukraine. On a different note, and as part of the largest government reshuffle since the outbreak of the war in February 2022, President Volodymyr Zelensky has appointed a new Prime Minister, Yulia Sverdenko, whose primary focus will be weapons production and the economy, along with several other key cabinet changes. Joining me now live to discuss the battlefield circumstances in Ukraine, the possibility of renewed escalation, and the prospects of negotiations is Alexander Filipenko, joining us from Vilnius, Lithuania. Alexander, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So first things first, Alexander, to what extent do you believe that this latest increase in US support for Ukraine, via NATO mechanisms of course, is directly linked to fears that Russia may be only days or weeks away from launching a renewed summer offensive?
Well, this is very important to note that this is going through the NATO countries. This is not just the U.S. Assistance or help to Ukraine or military assistance to Ukraine. It's going through NATO countries. And for some time now, NATO officials, even representatives of NATO and of including military representatives, have been quite worried about Russia's activities and Russia's readiness to launch a new offensive or to revamp its offensive, although, as Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, has said, from January 1st, 100,000 Russian soldiers died on the battlefield. Even though these numbers are staggering, of course, although NATO officials for some time now have been quite worried about Russia's newest offensive and new weaponry that's been bought from Iran previously and now from North Korea. Additionally, North Korean soldiers taking part in possibly new Russian offensive, etc., etc. So we are seeing the, let's say, more activity on the Russian side, and that is why the United States have confirmed and reaffirmed their support for Ukraine. And now we are even seeing redirecting some orders, some military orders. For example, the Swiss order was redirected to Ukraine. The Swiss Ministry of Defense has confirmed that the U.S. is redirecting 5 Patriot systems that were ordered in 2022 and were supposed to be delivered to Switzerland. Now it's redirected to Ukraine. So this, of course, cannot come only as a reaction of President Trump. Of course, we've been seeing the change in President Trump's heart, but definitely this has to have real stand within NATO, real difference. Something has made a difference for NATO countries and the way they are treating the situation right now. Of course, they've always been very engaged in helping Ukraine, but for some time now, and especially since spring, since the meeting of ministers of foreign affairs of NATO in spring in Brussels, we've been hearing more and more about Russian activities on the Ukraine front and the aims and the goals of Russia, goals of Putin, mainly, of course, to get more territory, as much territory, gain as much territory as they can. And that is why they do not care how many people die, how many Russian soldiers die. They're just moving forward and forward, and there is no indication that Russia wants to stop. That is why we are seeing some new coordination, new planning headed, let's say, by President Trump through NATO.
And what do you make of the latest deal announced by President Donald Trump that requires cooperation between the United States and Europe? And it looks like that Europe needs to pay for that support. And actually, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas recently mentioned that if we are paying for that weaponry, it means that it is our support. Do you think this new Trump scheme, to which I made reference earlier, is going to prove tenable?
Well, this is the biggest question right now, because me being American studies specialist, I understand that for Donald Trump, for the Republicans, for Americans in general, for US voters, it's extremely important to see that the money is not spent from the US budget. Of course, they want to continue supporting Ukraine. Most Americans want to continue supporting Ukraine, but they all divide in how should the United States continue its support. Either they should be putting more pressure on Russia. Some are saying only this will be enough. New sanctions on Russia will be enough. Some are saying that, yes, new shipments of weapons, new weapons should be sent to Ukraine. And the others are saying only financial support, nothing else. So within the fraction of those who are saying that, yes, we should continue supporting Ukraine, there are actually three divisions. So these divisions are showing that one of the most important things is financial stability of Americans themselves. Most of them, 2/3 of those out of those who want to continue supporting Ukraine, 2/3 want to support Ukraine, but for that support not to come from their pocket, not to come from the budget of the United States. That is why it was extremely important for domestic policy of the United States, for President Trump to showcase that he's not spending anyone's money. He's not spending his constituents' money. He's not spending Americans' money. He's not taking anything from the budget of the United States. That is why he said many, many times that Europe is going to pay for it. The weapons are going to be shipped to NATO countries, and NATO countries will pay for it. But it seems, although President Trump announced it sitting right next to Mark Rutte, it seems that European countries were not ready for it. Or at least maybe they discussed it, but it wasn't set in stone by that point. And of course, right now, it's a big question where the money will come from. Will the money come from the NATO budget? Will the money come from those 2 to 5% of GDP that are going to collective defense? Where the money is going to come from? For President Trump, it seems it's a little bit, it reminds me of the saying, fake it till you make it. So he announced it, and it seems it was quite a surprise for European partners, although the European partners and NATO countries really understand that supporting Ukraine is actually supporting their own independence, supporting their own security, supporting their own stability. Because I think it's difficult to find a NATO country that would not agree that if Ukraine fell, then President Putin will eye some other NATO countries, including the Baltic states. For example, I am in Lithuania, and of course in Lithuania, people are very worried about Putin eyeing Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia, any of the Baltic states. So that is why NATO countries like no one else understand that helping Ukraine is vital for their security. So most probably they will find the finances. But of course, it was definitely a surprise. This is kind of a language of ultimatums, let's say, by President Trump, because ultimately, he said that Europe is going to pay for it, and they should act as quickly as possible. So NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said that the alliance is cooperating with Germany, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, UK, the Netherlands, and Canada to finance the deliveries, but we are still waiting to see if that is correct, if really those countries are ready to finance the deliveries of US weapons.
Thank you, Alexandra. I think that the general perception a few months ago was that President Donald Trump after February 2025 had changed the debate surrounding Ukraine, with a possibility of some sort of compromise with Russia being actively discussed. But now it looks like we are back to square one. We're back to what I would conditionally call pre-28th of February equilibrium, with the only crucial difference being that Washington now expects Europe to shoulder the bulk of the financial burden. And now it looks like that we are back to that square one, wherein we used to have, when I say we used to have, I mean the general geopolitical scope used to be sort of based on two fundamental linchpins of supporting Ukraine by all sorts of means, directly and indirectly, financially and also militarily in the direct form, and also by means of adding pressure on Russia, by means of sanctions with the purpose of crippling its economy. It looks like we're back to that square one, because if you remember a few months ago, President Donald Trump used to say that sanctions should not be imposed on Russia because we are in the process of negotiations. So he wanted to be kind of constructive, but it looks like he's now very much frustrated with Russia's reaction, and therefore now he's also back to that European camp, with the only exception that he expects Europeans to pay. What do you make of that latest 18th sanctions package? Do you think that that is going to bear upon the battlefield circumstances?
Well, I think that talking about sanctions and those sanctions or tariffs or 100% tariffs are secondary sanctions against countries that buy Russian oil, and President Trump's 50 days lag and that ultimatum for a ceasefire and promise, and those sanctions, that 18th package of sanctions or any other package of sanctions should be considered and should be thought about and should be discussed together with the supplies of weapons to Ukraine. Because in the history of the world, and even right now, we are seeing so many countries are living under sanctions. So many countries. Yes, the life is not that easy. If we look at Venezuela, if we look at Iran, if we look at North Korea, if we look at other countries or Cuba that are living under sanctions, of course, life for the people is not that easy. But it doesn't show any kind of restraint on the governments of those countries. Those sanctions, of course, they influence the economies of the countries, but they do not crumble under those sanctions. And that's the same, I think, as we've been seeing regarding Russia. Of course, it's extremely important for sanctions to stay in place. They should stay in place. They do restrain Russia's economy. They do restrain Russia's possibility to produce more weapons or to recruit more people to continue their offensive and continue killing people, etc., etc. But it seems that it's more important to supply weapons to Ukraine than to have the 18th, 19th, 20th, or any other package. So you effectively
think that actually increasing support for Ukraine matters more than actually trying or making attempts to cripple Russian economy, because Russia is an incredibly resilient country, and those sanctions have not proven to be as crippling as they intended to be. So that active military support aimed at increasing Ukraine's military capabilities must be priority number one. Is that what you just said, Alexandra?
To me, it seems this way. I'm not an economist, but to me, it seems that it's Patriot, for example, systems, air defense systems in general, any kind of air defense systems, is what can have more effect, I'd say, on the battlefield for Ukraine, Patriot air defense systems for Ukraine, than newer sanctions. And of course, pressure on any countries that are buying Russian oil and Russian mineral resources. Of course, India, Brazil, China, if it's possible to somehow make those countries not buy Russian mineral resources, that is great. And we are seeing this from India. India is now showing that maybe they will move on from Russian natural resources and they will buy it from Brazil and from Latin America. This, of course, will influence Russia in general, Russian economy in general. But for me, it seems, looking back at the history, the sanctions have been there. Some sanctions have been there since 2014, and it didn't stop Putin from the full-scale invasion of 2022. So maybe supplying Ukraine, helping Ukraine is more crucial than newer sanctions or new packages of sanctions.
And what's your assessment of the appointment of Yulia Svyridenko as Ukraine's new prime minister? It has been suggested that, of course, she worked very closely as deputy prime minister with American counterparts on a minerals deal. To what extent might this appointment reflect the desire to appease Washington rather than a singular focus on internal governance and efficiency? Because Yulia Svyridenko is widely believed to be somebody highly appreciated by Americans in the first place.
And her name is known by the American public because, as you've just pointed out, yes, her name was mentioned as, of course, the head of the Ministry of Economy. Her name was mentioned during the minerals deal, and she signed that minerals deal. So for President Trump, she's the face of that minerals deal on the Ukraine side. And she was the deputy head of the office of the president, and she also played a key role in conducting several deals with the United States. And of course, she is a very well-known figure. And also, I would point out not only to her appointment that is actually crucial, and I believe that it is somehow, let's say, a show by President Zelensky that, first of all, he is ready to change his cabinet. He is ready to maybe not bring in absolutely new figures, but to promote different figures to prominent positions and to have them more seen, more known by the international community. But also a very important appointment by the new Ukraine's ambassador to the United States. The acting Minister of Justice, Olga Stefanishyna, will be the Ukraine's ambassador to the US. So these changes that are happening right now, the biggest changes, I would say, from the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the biggest changes since 2022 in the Ukrainian government, these changes are showing that for Zelensky, it's important to not to stay in place, not to keep everything as it is for years and years. And he many times has said that as soon as it's going to be possible, he would go for elections, and elections is a sacred word for the Americans, of course. So new faces, new people, that is, of course, very important also for the American side, and and for NATO countries. We've started talking to you about NATO. Mark Rutte recently said that what can we expect from Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia? I think I'm quoting Mark Rutte here. He's been the Minister of Foreign Affairs since Jesus Christ, I think. So, of course, it's a staunch difference. It's a big difference from what the United States are seeing in Russia. Same faces for years and years and years and years on the same places, and in Ukraine. Changing, interchanging, moving around, etc., etc. So I think it's all a very important sign, and of course, it's first of all, it's noted and duly noted, I'm sure, by the United States.
And my last question to you, Alexandra: what is the current aim for Ukraine? We understand that battlefield circumstances leave a lot to be desired. Recently, I had an opportunity to converse with former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko, and I put to him this question. I said that there are two possibilities. One option is actually fully recovering Ukraine's territorial integrity, including Crimea, but losing this opportunity of becoming a member of NATO and European Union. And a second option being, losing, effectively agreeing to the temporary loss. I needed to be diplomatic, that's why I use the word, the temporary loss of Crimea and certain sections of eastern Ukraine, but with the opportunity of joining NATO and European Union. I said that, would you find this as a false dichotomy? And his response was that full restoration of territorial integrity and sovereignty, with full sovereign rights in terms of joining NATO and European Union. That seems to dominate the thinking of many Ukrainians. I mean, because we often talk about the realpolitik, about even Americans used to talk about necessity of recognizing in a legal sense of the word, Russian control of Crimea and certain sections of Ukraine. But that's not what many Ukrainians believe should be the case. So my question to you, what is the current interim aim for Ukraine at this very juncture in midsummer 2025?
Well, to be honest, most Ukrainians, as I can see, are not planning that far ahead. The main problem right now for today, as we're talking to today, is weapons and money, weapons and financial support for Ukraine, for wounded, for children, for people who lost their homes, etc., etc. Most Ukrainians do not plan that far ahead. It's very difficult to plan that far ahead having Russian army on your territory. Of course, the end game, the end goal is coming back to the to 1991 Ukraine, let's say to Ukraine as a whole, the Ukraine borders recognized by the international community. This is the end goal for most people. This is the end goal for, I would say, most Ukrainians, if not 100% Ukrainians, although we see the reality on the ground. And some of them are now, let's say, allowing themselves to think about the Welles Declaration, for example. And Keith Kellogg, the special representative of Donald Trump, has repeatedly talked about the Welles Declaration. Me being, again, in Lithuania, I know it very well. It was the declaration of 1940 after the occupation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union. After that occupation, the United States did not recognize legally the right of the Soviet Union to be here, but de facto, they recognize that the Soviet Union is on this territory. So this is one of the things that Ukrainians sometimes allow themselves to think about. But right now, the main issue is weapons and financial support. And if we're talking about the end game, the long goal is, of course, coming back to the borders of 1991, let's say, or prior to 2014, prior to the occupation of Crimea. For most Ukrainians, and if not all Ukrainians, all believe that this should be the end of the war, of course. And although, as we all understand, there is in the back of everyone's minds, there is this thought of the, let's say, Welles Declaration by the United States, the new Welles Declaration by the United States, when de facto the appearance of this time Russia, that time the Soviet Union, was not accepted, but was duly noted by the United States and the international community, but legally it was not accepted, and it was not accepted as legal and as de jure. Let's put
the case of Baltic countries is quite different. They never accepted joining the Soviet Union in the first place. That's the reason why they of course, they regained their independence. And back to the point about Ukraine, also the questions have been asked about the necessity of not signing anything now with permanent legal consequences. That's the reason why I asked about that. Of course, daily survival is a daily matter, with that end game always in mind. Alexander Filipenko, I'm so grateful to you for your time. Thank you very much for joining Context today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That was Alexander Filipenko, political analyst from Vilnius, Lithuania. We discussed the battlefield circumstances in Ukraine, the possibility of new Russian offensive and increased US support for Ukraine, with all the other enveloping circumstances in mind. You've been watching Context, and see you very soon indeed.